Hello, this is Marta Roda, welcoming you to a virtual panel discussion, Proctoring 2.0, Life After the Pandemic, with a great panel. So welcome everyone, great to have you here. And let me tell you first that this session is being hosted by Datamatics, which is a global service provider in providing proctoring services, both human resources, but also bringing intelligence and efficiency into the whole proctoring process. So thank you for hosting that. And before I start introducing our great panelists, let me give you a bit of the background of this very important discussion item. Because when the pandemic saw mass adoption of remote proctoring by universities and organizations alike to take assessment from remote locations while ensuring the integrity of the exam. While remote proctoring as a concept launched way back in 2007, technologies and growth around it have evolved over time. In many ways, it came of age during the pandemic in terms of its span and scope. It was imperative for educational institutes, universities and organizations to jump in and adapt to a scalable, time and cost-effective solution for their examinations and assessments. However, with the pandemic on the decline and the world going back to the old ways of functioning and assessing, we're seeing high-stake exams, some of them going back to offline testing, even as mid or low-stake exams continue to remain online. Are these early trends, or is there more to it? Remote proctoring is certainly an interesting crossroads and needs to hear from the key leaders and influencers of what will be the direction. Let me add a bit of complication to it, because what we've seen recently is more of a backdrop. A lot of cases where people were objecting against remote proctoring, there was litigation, there were letters from senators, there was legislation, and even more recently, which was a bit shocking to the industry, that was the ruling in Ohio against or for the room scans for remote proctoring to be unconstitutional, which was very surprising. And the question is, so will remote proctoring be obstructed, or will we see a decline because of all of those issues? Well, we're here from our panel, and so first of all, let me introduce myself. I'm Marta Roda, as I said, Chief Measurement and Learning Officer with REIT, and also Senior Consulting Advisor at Datamatics Global Services. Then our first panelist, I'll mention, is Alan Thiemann, who is ATP General Counsel and also partner with Hans Santos. So he knows a lot of all those legal issues. Then our next panelist is David Foster. He is CEO of Cavion, and also chairperson of the Cavion Board of Directors, and also was essential back in 2006 at the start of this whole technology of remote proctoring, as I worked with David on introducing that technology to the market. Then our next panelist is John Weiner. He is Chief Science Officer at PSI, and PSI is, I think, one of the, or maybe even the leading provider of proctoring services. Then we have Kelly Testi. She is the President and CEO of the Law School Admissions Council. They run, of course, the LSAT, which is very interesting because they made a very bold decision to go 100% online shortly after the pandemic hit in. So we'll hear more about her considerations with that. So after we introduced our panelists, before we start asking them questions, I would like to hear from the audience, and thank you all for being here. We'll ask a few questions, one first, and then later on, one or two more. So let me ask a poll question to the audience. You'll see that pop up if everything works. And this is about how likely do you think that online proctoring would replace offline proctoring in the next few years? So well, let's see if that will come up on your screen, and then please answer the question within the next 30 seconds or so. Is that working? I cannot see it, but there it is. So from 1 to 10, how likely do you think online proctoring would replace offline proctoring in the next 1 to 2 years? Pencils down, I would say. Oh, there we go. So what's the score? Well, it's a nice spread. So wow, from 1 to 10, that's interesting statistically. But there's a bit more around 6, 7, and 8. But also, interestingly, there's a bit of a peak. So it's, how do they call that, bipolar, or what is it? Like, it's not a nice bell curve, but also a bit of a peak at 2 and 3. So you see that the audience is divided on this, which makes it even more interesting to have this discussion. So we'll keep this in mind, and then we'll get back to it later on. So at the end of the session, we'll ask this question again and see if opinions changed. So now let's get to the panel and ask the first question. The first question is, are we actually seeing, or will we be seeing, a decline in the use of remote proctoring now that the pandemic is largely over? And do we actually see examples of programs getting back to offline, like the test center, and even completely into the test center again? And I'd like to hear John's answer first on this.
Martin, thank you. And thank you, Datamatics, for putting this panel together. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. In my experience, at PSI, we're working with a wide range of testing programs. And of course, the pandemic was an accelerant to the trend to increase the use of online remote proctored testing for high stakes testing. What we've seen is that there were a few cases where it was, you could say that online was remote proctoring was temporary, but I'd say that I think that's the minority of cases that we're seeing. The vast majority of cases have retained, those that switched or started adopting online remote proctored testing have retained it. And I think that's why I think I agree with the poll results, because I think what it's saying is it's mixed. And I think the message here is that mixed mode testing is sort of the new normal, I believe, and will be for the foreseeable future. One quick point I want to make, and so we can make this more conversational, is that when we talk about proctoring, we're talking about today, a point in time, and of course it's evolving. So today's online proctoring and today's brick and mortar testing is not the same as tomorrow's. So it's all quickly evolving. I'll stop there and give others a chance to weigh in.
Yeah, thanks.
This is Dave. Yeah, I think that before the pandemic, online proctoring was increasing in popularity, slowly perhaps, but there were reasons why people liked it and wanted to use it. I'm thinking there are other reasons besides the pandemic to use it. For example, the lack of equipment to test people on the computer in schools would lead people to look for other options than a fixed location with equipment. So that's just one reason. So I think those reasons are going to remain after the pandemic winds down.
David, I agree with you and John. I think we're we're in a world where some part of that's here to stay, but everyone loves choice, and so I think the mixed modality is likely to be where we are for some time, both for the choice preference. We're seeing in our own context, our customers want a choice, and so I think that there's other reasons to support that, including, I know Alan will talk a little bit about the court decision Martin mentioned, and I think choice helps us there too.
Yeah.
Well, that makes it unanimous then, guys, because I fully agree that mixed choices for how to go about dealing with surveillance, proctoring of exams is absolutely going to be with us. I agree with Martin and David's point that it was actually expanding prior to the pandemic. Pandemic certainly aided in making a lot of technology options actually more available, and that did have certainly a positive impact on providing remote proctoring solutions. Even after we get back to somewhat of a normal situation, I'm pretty sure that I think I'm hearing from all of you, and certainly the folks that I work with in my law practice would say that there are abundant reasons, even if we continue to have physical location testing, why online testing is still valid and useful.
Yeah, thank you. Just very briefly, John, at the end of your answer, you alluded to some developments. Can you be a bit more specific about that, what you meant with that?
Yeah, well, I think, we might be getting into some of these later, but I think some of the developments maybe on the, let's say on the remote proctoring side is I think we're seeing more what I would call technology enhanced proctoring. I think for a while, we were talking about AI assisted proctoring or AI proctoring. I think there's been somewhat of a pullback from that concept. And now it's more about technology assisted proctoring, kind of like technology assisted driving, right? Mm-hmm. Lane keeping assist, blind spot monitoring. Proctors need those tools, and those tools are good. And I think we'll see more of that. So the role of the proctor will change. Mm-hmm. The use of technology, but it won't be. I think the idea of autonomous AI is probably not going to happen for a while.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, John. So let's move to the next question now, which is about how high the stakes can be in remote proctoring. And I can remember in the early days we said, well, we can be at least as secure as in the test center. So it was more a matter of trust before like the real very high stakes programs would be start to using the remote proctoring. And then of course the pandemic pushed into that much more. And so let's start with hearing from Kelly. And maybe you can give a bit of insight of how the decision-making process when the pandemic hit happened at LSAC, because that was, I really. And so that really stood out as a very brave brave decision and well made.
Thank you, Martin. And it's always good to be with you and the other panelists. And I also thank Datamatics for bringing this webinar forward today. When you say the word high stakes, you immediately think of law school and the LSAT. And right. So we are absolutely in that world. The LSAT remains the single most effective predictor of law school success. So all the law schools use it, sometimes overuse it, despite our advice. And so when students sit for it, it's a very high stakes environment. And we did, Martin, as you note, decide as the pandemic hit that we were going to move to a remote proctoring delivery for the LSAT. I work and have long worked in Seattle, very tech heavy, environment. And it was also ground zero for the pandemic. Many of you may remember that Seattle was one of the early places in the U.S. where the pandemic was starting. And so our best view was that this was not going to go away in a short time and that it was going to be with us for a while. And so we pivoted very quickly to take the technology that we had developed to deliver the LSAT digitally to be able to deliver it remotely. And I will say that we were fortunate to partner with an effective partner in terms of online proctoring, Proctor.U, now Measure Learning. And they were good partners because we both had to move as organizations very quickly to make that change. So sometimes I say as a leader that we just have to decide and commit. And I'm glad we did, because as we all know, the pandemic did unfortunately continue to extend, and we were able to keep the admissions process for legal education rolling with and have a very good season. You know, we had actually quite increased applicants and a very good season in doing that. It's not without its hitches, as we all know, and I'd be glad to talk more about those as the program goes on. But we've been satisfied, and our candidates have largely been satisfied. Yes, there are glitches, but we all know that as you're getting to a test center, there are glitches too. And so, you know, sometimes the technology issues are the modern day equivalent of the flat tire on the way to the test center. But overall, the satisfaction is high. It seems to reduce anxiety among the test takers, and that they don't have to try and get somewhere. So we anticipate continuing with this modality. We also do anticipate bringing forward an option of being in a test center. And that's not very different than what we've been doing, because we are very equity conscious, and we wanted to make sure that our choice for technology did not disadvantage persons who may not have access to an internet connection that's strong enough, or a quiet place, or even a device. And so during the time we rolled out the online LSAT, we actually gave out loaner devices, and we also made available places for people to test quietly and with adequate internet connection to assure that equity. Thank you, Martin. Glad to talk about any of those points as we move forward.
Yeah, it's a great story. Thank you for sharing. And who else would? John?
Yeah, I think just taking what you were mentioning, Kelly, about equity, fairness, accessibility. These are reasons that, for multimode testing, these are reasons why we need test centers as well as online, because they're both scenarios, right? So I was just, going back, reviewing the latest Pew Research Center data on the digital divide, right? It's still there. So low income household access to broadband versus high income access, the differences are still pretty big. It's like you're talking about a little more than 50% versus over 90% access. So people that don't have broadband or a good location do need a test center or some version of a test center. So I think that's
It made a tremendous difference. We provided thousands of loaner devices and thousands of hotel rooms and other places where people could safely test during the pandemic. And we saw the applicants from minoritized backgrounds and first-gen backgrounds increase. I think that was not a coincidence. I think it was due to putting our hand on the side of equity.
That's great. Yeah. And just one quick point is on the flip side of that is people who do have the ability to access via the internet save a lot of money. People who couldn't test are able to test because they're in remote locations, or they'd have to fly or travel, and it gets really expensive. So it's been really helpful in that.
And in the case of disability community too, that's particularly onerous sometimes for one with disability to have to get to a test center. And so we designed very much for accessibility. And I think that's also something we all need to keep front and center as we go forward.
Yeah, great point about equity and accessibility. So if we look at like the high stakes, do you think, Alan, you're going to make a comment also about high stakes how high could the stakes be, do you think?
Well, my comment really, Martin, had more to do with another benefit of kind of being able to offer up online as an option and how it plays in. If you look at privacy considerations as well, there are value propositions about online, but there are some equal issues that are being now litigated and regulated around the need for having an option for online. And when you start looking at video surveillance in an online setting, and you realize that that raises some biometric issues, now the flip side of having online as an opportunity that used to be considered as a solution and accommodation for a disability, now you're flipping it over the other way, Kelly, and it's the disability coverage now to get out of an online assessment is to do it in person. So it's kind of in a way that some of the considerations from a privacy and AI and video surveillance biometric perspective still offer up this valid reason for balance.
Yeah. David, could you I remember the discussion we would have early on, in the development about high stakes. And then, of course, it took a while. I remember, for instance, like Pearson saying, well, this will never work for high stakes. And then only after Microsoft, one of the biggest customers, said, well, we want it. Then they said, well, sure, of course it can be done. So how do you look at the at that aspect of it?
I think that Kelly is on is presenting today on the panel, and she's seen it working well with the LSAC, LSAT, and that proof is in the pudding. I mean, it works as well for high stakes testing. Well, in fact, I'm a believer in only high stakes testing versus no stakes testing. If it has some importance to people, they're going to cheat, and you need some way to manage the security of your program. Online proctoring, remote proctoring is as effective as on-site or in-center based proctoring in terms of taking care of security. None of the panelists have mentioned a big difference between the two modes of testing based on security. And indeed, I don't think there is. I mean, there's some minor advantages to one over the other and vice versa. So, but both of them deal not great, but deal adequately with security. They can both be improved in many ways. But I think definitely if on-site testing can deal with high stakes tests, so can online proctoring. So I've said that, I think, for years now. I believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Quick point to underscore Dave's point, which is Association of Test Publishers recently put out a special issue in their Journal of Applied Testing Technology on online remote proctoring and looked at comparability issues. And one of them had to do with, what's the difference in forensic flagging or security incidents? And, we weren't seeing a big difference or any difference really from that perspective. So kind of to your point, Dave.
ATP has also, John, put out privacy bulletins that go in the direction of talking about video surveillance and security issues. And I don't think we would say there's any significant difference in the way you would handle a high stakes and a low stakes exam from those perspectives. You still have to, and that's why I focused on privacy and AI, you still have to protect the data and deal with the security implications almost regardless of the stakes that are involved.
Yeah. So let me get back to David. In addition to what you said, and looking back in time, so do you think potentially the remote proctoring could knock out the brick and mortar, and maybe there'll be, if you talk hybrid, there's also the possibility, of course, and some of you alluded to it very briefly. If like an offline might not always be like a test center as we know it. So is there any way that that new versions of proctoring or online testing could eventually knock out the brick and mortar test center as we know it?
It's a great question. I think after this, we'll see a retraction after the pandemic a bit, but the advantages of online remote proctoring are just in the practical advantages, cost and convenience are going to continue to win the day for the online proctoring process. I mean, in the poll, when I couldn't answer it, but I would have picked a 1, that in 1 to 2 years, that's, and I'm not even sure in 10 years that's going to happen. Just examples that I think are really close to our circumstances are online banking and online shopping. Yeah. I mean, who of us doesn't go to stores, but maybe does a lot of shopping online or banking? I mean, I go to the bank a couple of times a year. I probably did it a lot more often in the past, and I do a lot of online banking. It's so convenient. I can do so much more. It seems easier. Mm-hmm. I think those are the kinds of things that are going to make online proctoring win the day eventually. I don't know when that's going to be. Maybe it's winning the day if it just keeps growing in proportion to the tests given at centers. I do think in order for online proctoring to make any huge gain, it's going to have a paradigm shift. Proctors are not very effective at detecting cheating, detecting someone stealing questions. And we know this from the services at Cavion. We do secret shopping, and pretty much whoever we send to a center or to do an online test through a remote proctor are able to do just about whatever they want in terms of cheating. There's going to have to be a shift. If either of these is going to win, be the preferred one, they're going to have to win in terms of security. And so I don't think proctors should be in the future responsible for trying to detect someone cheating or someone trying to steal content. They're not good at it. They never will be good at it, despite AI enhancements. Those aren't going to do much more than just a little boost. It's going to have to be a shift in the way people secure their exams with design of their tests. That's going to make a bigger shift, and it's going to take pressure off of proctors that they can do what they do best, which is deal with customers. If the system itself detects a cheater doing something, then the proctors can deal with it. So there ought to be more of that kind of work, not trying to mimic what the proctor can do as of AI, but just trying to be better at security. So, I think if that happens, then it's probably faster than 10 years.
David, I want to agree with you and say that from our experience, the quality of the proctor is just so critical to the customer experience. And so recognizing that this is a field of work that's likely to have a lot of turnover, it's really important to make those roles simple and repeatable so that experience for the customer is as strong as it can be. Because if your idea is that this will reduce anxiety, there's nothing that's going to pep up anxiety more than a proctor that doesn't know what they're doing, or that you get booted around from proctor to proctor or something like that. So I think the more the security can come from both on the front end and on the back end in design, so that is more of a customer service role. Primarily, it will make this methodology more effective.
Yeah. If I could chime in real quickly, this is what I think I was alluding to kind of early on when I'm talking about the evolution. Okay, we're talking about even outside of the world of assessment, process automation is happening, throughout daily life. And, and as that gets better and more effective, that's going to spill over into everything we do, including how we make tests secure and the tasks that proctors perform. I love looking at related research. I was looking at a report by the World Economic Forum, okay, and they're talking about the future of work in this report. I recommend this report. Basically, they're saying that, by the second half of this decade, half of the time spent performing the work the tasks that we perform today it's going to be equal human and machine. And then it's just going to go from there. So work is becoming more and more automated. So I think this is what Dave is saying too. Some of the tasks that proctors perform today won't need to be performed. They'll be performed differently and better through some automated process. It's going to change. So at some point, there will be a tipping point where it will be so much more accurate, so much more cost effective that the role of the test center will become probably a minor role for just those who really need it for accessibility.
But I think the problem with some of that thinking, John, and I don't disagree at all about automation. I would support both what you and David have been saying on that. But I would actually point out that in what's been going on in the debate about intelligence is kind of on both sides of that fence. On the one hand, you've got a bunch of folks who are looking at AI and going, there has to be a human intervention, a human involvement in the process. And they don't mean in just developing the AI software. They mean actual process of dealing with the data. So you probably can't, in that context, get rid of a human in the middle process. So keeping a human proctor, is certainly going to be instrumental, I think, in dealing with how you get around the whole regulatory environment about AI. But having quality proctors and dealing with how those proctors handle the work they're supposed to do and finding irregularities, making a record of those irregularities so that an escalation process, the sponsor can figure out whether the score has been affected or not. Those are really important things. And I would just give a little plug for the ATP proctoring standards process that is underway. We have addressed, I think, that kind of situation of what is a proctoring situation, good practices for proctoring, whether it is remote, alone, a live proctor, or some kind of a proctoring done after the and hybrid situation where there's technology involved as well.
Let me just follow up. It's partly an element, others as well. Proctors are not very good at detecting cheating and theft. But a lot of cheating and theft occurs anyway. Just as example, pre-knowledge. People get the items off the internet and they come. They already know the answers to the questions. Proctors cannot tell who's cheating and who isn't. Hidden cameras, they can't tell who's stealing content and who isn't. And so people, however, most testing programs still rely on proctors to do those things when they don't do them well. That's why we need a shift. These proctors, and I don't doubt they're always going to be around. They just can't be doing what they're doing today because what they're doing today misses most of what's happening. So it's going to be a change for them. The programs have to create tests that take care of themselves. The proctors will not care if a person picks up a camera and takes a picture in full view of the webcam. Will not care if they pick up a book. Will not care about a lot of these things. And the security will absolutely go up if proctors can be retrained to be more customer service representatives. They're still there, Alan, and they'll deal with issues that come up, but you don't have to rely on them to find out everything that's going on because they absolutely cannot do it.
Well, I think I'm going to say a similar thing, Dave, is that, yes, I agree with Alan, human in the loop somewhere is necessary. But I don't think, I'll just say it. I don't think there's going to be a proctor role in the future. I think it's going to be a different job. I'm going to say it's not going to be, you don't need to call it a proctor. Some people don't even call it a proctor now. So I think it's moving away from that job, from that role. It's going to be something else because of tools that are provided to people. It's, you could look in history at many jobs where that's happened. And this is probably another one of those.
Mhm. Well, great discussion, Alan. I think you're about to make more comments, but so let's get back to you, but then also with more specific questions around, so what are the regulatory and litigation issues that remote proctoring is facing right now, and how serious are they? Especially if you look at, and I saw a lot of the questions in the Q&A section, people were asking about Ohio, that ruling. Do you take that seriously? What are the issues and what can we do about it?
Sure. Thank you, Martin. And thank you to Datamatics as well for hosting. Let me just go ahead and deal with Ohio, I guess, since I've seen several questions already. It's endemic to your question about both the regulatory system and litigation. We've had some litigation here in Ohio, but there have been, I think, 7 other data protection authorities who have addressed remote proctoring in Europe prior to this Ohio case. So I just want to make sure people are aware that, we've had the University of Amsterdam, we had a decision out of Spain, we had a decision out of France, a decision out of Sicily, a decision by the Norwegian DPA, and one out of Italy. So it's not like there aren't other regulatory bodies that are looking at this from a privacy perspective. So I'll deal with that in a minute. Let me go to Ohio. So the critical thing about Ohio, Cleveland State University is the institution involved, and it's a state university. So it is not a private school. And the Fourth Amendment has no impact on private institutions, private businesses. It is strictly a constitutional issue for the state involvement. So it's a state university, hence the Fourth Amendment argument could be made. I think, unfortunately, it's a terrible decision for a lot of reasons. I hope the Ohio State Attorney General appeals the decision. It has limited impact right now. It only applies to Ohio. If it goes on appeal to the Sixth Circuit, it could apply to Indiana and Michigan as well. And Kentucky, but that's, I think, still not as big a deal when you examine the facts. And the facts were that the school had a very laissez-faire approach with their professors in how they were going to implement proctoring. And they left it up to individual teachers, professors to do thing. And in this case, the student who brought the lawsuit was only informed a couple hours before the test about the scanning process that was going to take place. He, of course, claimed that he had tax papers and stuff strewn around and he couldn't take care of it. Of course, that ignores the fact that he could have gone to the library. He could have gone somewhere else. He could have packed up his papers and kept them secret. But this individual has already, by the way, sued other people. So he's a litigious individual plaintiff in the first place. But the school and institutions who want to institute proctoring have to realize that whether you're talking about GDPR, whether you're talking about the United States with California and Ohio, Virginia, Colorado, Utah, Connecticut, a few other states that are coming online with state privacy laws, whether you're talking about the pendency of potentially some sort of federal privacy law enforced by the Federal Trade Commission, whether you're looking at Canada with PIPEDA, or looking at China, I don't care where you're located, you have to consider a sort of a general rubric around how you want to go about instituting any kind of proctoring. And that means finding out what basis you have to use any proctoring services. I mean, obviously you can get consent, but like under GDPR, you can't get informed consent when you're telling the test taker, if you don't consent, you can't take the test. That's not voluntary consent. So you have to look for something else. Is there a contract? Well, yes, but not really with the student. Same issue about leverage. So you have to look at public interest, like occurred in the University of Amsterdam and the other DPA cases in Europe. Those were public institutions, public universities. And so the DPAs found in those first 3 or 4 cases that there was a public interest to be served in how the public institution balanced the rights of test takers with their needs to ensure the integrity of the testing process and the ability to ensure that the results of the test were not fraudulent. So those are sort of the legal issues that come up. And I think in Ohio, the problem was the university did not conduct a data protection impact assessment, which is sort of like the hallmark of the requirements under GDPR. It's not as crystal clear here in the United States. We don't have a law that requires a data protection impact assessment, but the process of evaluating the rights of test takers versus the rights of the institution, whether that's an employer or a school or a certification body, is really not different. The same rudimentary procedures have to be followed to examine whether or not there's value and whether you're taking account of the rights of the test taker. So I would say the problem with Ohio rests with the procedures that were used from the school more than it does with the impediment of a bad decision standing there as precedent.
Yeah, thank you, Alan. So, maybe only a very brief comment because we have some other questions that we also want to ask. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Martin. I was just going to comment to Alan's very good summary that the other issue I think we all have to be watchful for is making sure people do understand the limits of this decision. Because I'm already hearing about some universities that are so worried about it, they're saying no online proctoring, and they're saying you can't give tests. And so I think if we're all, I hope to see online education continue to flourish. I don't think it's appropriate to be reaching in and telling faculty how to test or not test. And so I'm hopeful that this can properly be kept in its place, as Alan has suggested.
Yeah, good point, Kelly. So the people should not panic about this. That's a great point. So before I move to some other questions and take a different perspective, not so much an industry perspective, but more of a candidate experience perspective, I would like to open up the poll question to the audience, the second poll question. So in your opinion, which format of examinations would candidates prefer in the post-COVID era? Would that be online or test center based, or you don't know? And you can also make a short comment on that to explain your answer. So please go ahead and vote. Okay, well, in your opinion, which format? Online examination? 57%, test center based, only 11%, and then 32% just don't know yet. We don't have the time to go through all the short answers, and also with looking at the clock, I would ask the panelists to briefly comment on this specific question, so not too long, because then we can open up the floor for questions from the audience. But anyone who would like to comment on this poll question, please.
This is Dave. I think that I agree with. I would have said online examination, like banking or shopping. I prefer that most of the time, and I think just for the practical cost and convenience, it's something that I would prefer, and I think most people would prefer.
Mm-hmm.
I'll say quickly that, yes, I think looking at the poll results, matches where we have a choice given. I think it matches, it's in the realm of what we see with candidates. It might be around 50-50, 60-40 in some cases. But I do want to throw in that
it was a bit difficult to hear, but so there's a bit of a strange sound when you speak,
Okay.
John.
Let me come back.
Kelly?
Martin, I can share our data on this question. When during the height of the pandemic, we were surveying all of our candidates, and it was running about 75 in favor of online, about 25 in favor of test centers. It's now started to shift to become a little closer to even, more 65-35 or 60-40. So that's certainly led us to, want to again provide the choice. But that's what our data has shown.
Interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting development.
And,
So
and
I
Kelly,
think
Yeah,
Kelly,
sure.
follow up on David's point, preference for online and Kelly's data suggesting online may still be a majority today. I think you have to consider the audience somewhat. I mean, as we get to a younger and younger test-taking audience, younger folks, unlike myself as an oldster sitting here, I mean, I'm dealing with online technology as effectively as I can, but I'm certainly nowhere near the kind of approach that even my kids would take. And some of these younger folks are growing up in an environment of online. That's why they're doing online banking and online shopping to the extent they are, David. So you're going to see those people wanting online assessment, I think, being even more. I know the MOOCs are expecting the demand for digital education and online assessment to grow, or online training to grow to $25.33 billion by 2025. So there's a huge expected growth in online education and learning.
Yeah, they're great points. So thank you. I'm looking at the questions from the audience. Very good questions, and I try to combine a few, which is also coming back to the quality of the proctors. Someone saying, as live proctors would be used as a third-party option. It's extremely important for proctors to know what is consideration of violation per the organization. Another one saying, it's about the quality of proctors depends on the provider, practices, and the training in place. There are many different practices, etc. So that is something I would like to ask from the panel, if you have a reaction to those kind of questions, the quality of the proctors.
I had one thought that I would share, Martin, and that is the notion about who's making the decision about what is an irregularity in a live proctoring or remote proctoring with a live human being situation. That is really not up to the proctor alone. It's got to be a decision by the sponsoring organization as to what kinds of events are considered irregularities, and that information has to be shared with the proctoring service provider, and some kind of an agreement worked out, usually a contractual agreement, by the way, with the proctoring service provider and the sponsoring organization as to what they want the proctors to catch or try to build a record around.
Right, very good point. Anyone else?
Yeah, that is true. Is my mic working?
John, it sounds like you're a little fuzzy still. I'll just interject that, as Alan's noted, I think the real complexity of the subject we're talking about is that there's just an alchemy of so many different factors. What kind of test, what kind of proctoring, and then the integration and the communication between those two things. Because you do have to make sure the proctors know all the things you're wanting them to do and what what triggers and what's not. And that's a real challenge when proctors are turning over. I mean, even with best effort of an online proctoring company, just managing that staffing and that personnel issue is significant. So I think there's a real complexity in this whole subject, because so much of the time the answer is it depends. What's the exact situation you're trying to assess, and then what's going to work as the modality and solution for that.
And I see, John, you're back.
I'm back. How am I coming through?
Yeah.
All right.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Okay. Well, I was just going to say the idea of proctor quality is obviously very important, and one that I know that it is an industry a best practice, which is to monitor and manage that just as a whole best practice. But to Alan's point, I think that is important in terms of what's an event, what's an incident, and so forth. How those get recorded. You're right. It's not just the proctor deciding that, Alan. It's all the things you mentioned, for sure. And yeah, the only other point I was going to make earlier, when my sound wasn't working and we were looking at the poll results, I did want to say that they match, I think, where we're offering a choice to test takers where there is online versus test center. I think we're seeing something like that in the 50-50 or 60-40 range, where people are selecting. And it does depend on the type of assessment, So maybe if it's, one industry, like a shorter assessment, like an IT certification versus a very long, medical exam, people might trend one way or the other, in terms of selecting which way they'd go.
I have another question from the audience. This one is from Wayne Kamara. Hi, Wayne. Much of the innovation panelists appear to refer to seems dependent on automated item generation or very large item pools. Are all tests able to take advantage of these technologies? And I would like to broaden that question a bit to more innovative technologies, like the use of artificial intelligence. Who could react to that?
I could give a first shot at it. I think when you talk about building large item pools, or the ability to present more unique exams to individuals, having 1,000 or 10,000 forms instead of half a dozen, that's changing your design of your test to protect it, which is going to make cheating and theft difficult to do. So that makes proctor's job a lot easier, because they don't really need to worry about those things. So that's a way to improve proctors, is by changing the design of your tests, which I think is going to be more and more popular as time goes by. I'm sure others want to comment on that as well.
Sure, I'd love to comment. I would just like to step back and say, let's think about the risks we're trying to manage against, right? So Dave makes a great point. I mean, if you had virtually unlimited content with automatic item generation, which I think Wayne Kamara was asking about, that could inoculate against certain risks, security risks, certainly theft of content pre-knowledge. But it doesn't help, let's say, with proxy testing. That's still a problem that wouldn't be addressed. So, you need a multi-pronged solution. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And addressing proxy, if I may, for a minute, and there was a question, Martin, from one of the audience about how do you get around AI, imposing AI, and then allowing the test taker to opt out. And I wanted to call attention to a recent language that came out of the European Commission that's considering AI regulation. This was a new statement issued on July 25th, so we're talking real recent, that basically says that when you're using AI for the purpose of validating the identity of a person, where you kind of know the person, like from a registered test taker, that is not considered AI. And I'm hopeful that we will be able, ATP's been making forays into the comments of European regulation of AI, Canadian regulation of AI, and even here we filed comments with NIST on how a U.S. regulation of AI is going to go. We are trying to drive home the points about uniqueness of testing situations where AI can be useful, is innovative, is needed to protect the integrity of the assessment process. And so this decision out of the EC on July 25th is critical to getting around the idea of biometrics imposed by things like the Illinois biometric act that says almost anything that takes an image of a person is considered a violation of the biometric law in Illinois.
So let me pause here because looking at the clock, so I would like to ask the team to bring up the first poll question again before I try to summarize this very lively and great discussion. So let's bring up that poll again and ask the audience to answer it again now after listening to all the great comments. So from 1 to 10, how likely do you think online proctoring would replace offline proctoring in the next 1 to 2 years? Let's see. Okay, well, there is a bit of a shift, I would say. And maybe, well, David, could you make a very short, quick interpretation of those scores? You're still on mute.
Probably not still. I've already put myself on mute. It's still pretty flat. I think there may have been a shift. I think we've convinced people that we're not going to be replacing centers anytime soon. And so that's my interpretation of this. I still would have picked a 1 if I were able to take the poll.
Yeah, there's a bit more 1, 2, and 3, especially the 1, the 16%. I think that's a shift, but overall it's still very spread. Okay, so that's great. So let me summarize because it's now, time's up, very, very clearly, and thank you panelists for all your great comments. I really appreciate that. It's clear that remote proctoring with all of its issues, regulatory, etc., is here to stay. There's no significant difference between online and offline, and it's definitely the direction is to offer choice. For any that fits your circumstances. If you don't feel okay with online, then you should be able to go to a test center, and especially in solving equity and accessibility issues. So also you see a shift in the role of the proctor, which is, the comments are that the proctor in the future cannot prevent all the fraud. There's much more that should be in the mix. And then the proctor in the future will become more of a customer relations person. And also the future technologies, the use of AIG, automated item generation, and using technologies to flag sessions really makes a different role of the proctor. We can keep discussing this for hours, I'm quite certain. And so once again, all panelists, thank you very, very much for all your great comments.